this has been originally, well, of course, it's specifically designed for a British audience. So within my normal stories, there will be lots of British phrases or words that might seem strange to people from America or Canada. However, I've gone through the whole process and tried to make it clear. But there's one word which, from past experience, I know I have to explain now. And the word is truncheon. Does everybody know what a truncheon is, or do I have to explain it? Explain, right? A truncheon is a stick or a club used to be used by British police before they were issued with these modern batons. In the States, they'd probably call them nightsticks. About that long, made of oak or ash. And they're, of course, used to quell any troublemakers with a quick knock on the noddle, so to speak. But just keep that explanation with you, truncheon. It will come clear ultimately as I proceed. But anyway, let's get on with it. Now, goodness knows why, but of the 100 or so topics of talks I give, most audiences, certainly initially when I go to a place for the first time perhaps, prefer to hear the confessions of a customs officer. Now, I have a sneaking suspicion that what they really want to know is what it feels like to smash down a door with a sledgehammer, to discover what really happens to all those confiscated goods, and what my emotions were as I ran my fingers through the unmentionables of the rich and famous. Well, before I go any further, I must point out that I'm still subject to a pernicious piece of legislation called the Official Secrets Act. And for me to even tell you more than my name, rank, and serial number could, in fact, land me in jail. So I shall tell you only what I believe you could find out for yourself from other sources, if you had the time and the inclination. And purely for the sake of entertainment, I shall invent incidents which some of you might think sound only too likely, but which I insist are purely figments of my imagination. Nothing, I repeat, nothing of interest happened to me in more than 30 years at the sharp end of customs and excise. And if you believe that, you'll believe anything. Now, to start with some facts, which, like all facts, tend to be a bit boring, even if relevant. So let's get them out of the way first. I joined the department after 10 years' service in the Royal Navy and 6 months being out of work. And I had neither knowledge nor interest in the department other than a way of securing a steady paycheck to support my family. And I joined at Dover, down the southeast coast, which I know some of you will know is the busiest sea passenger port in the world. And it was a good move because apart from the fact that it is a very pleasing little town, there was plenty of overtime going. And but after a few days, I decided it was worth knowing a little bit more of what I was in for. So I delved into the history of the department, and I discovered that it was the very oldest Department of State, having been privatized by King John, but brought back into public ownership by King Charles II in 1671. And inevitably, over those hundreds of years, a good number of famous or infamous people have served their time as either customs or excise officers. For instance, Dick Whittington, the Lord Mayor of London all those years ago, George Downing, after whom Downing Street is named, where the Prime Minister has his home, Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations and invented really market forces rule okay, which has probably dropped us all where we are today as a consequence. Daniel Defoe, he who wrote Robinson Crusoe. Robbie Burns, the revered Scottish poet. Geoffrey Chaucer wrote Canterbury Tales. Samuel Pepys, the diarist. My favorite, Tom Paine, the revolutionary. And King Charles's mistress, Nell Gwyn, who, the records show, received £500 per annum for services rendered to the crown. Now, recently, the department merged with the Inland Revenue and became Revenue and Customs, but people, even now, still refer to Customs and Excise. Now, not everybody knows, I know, that the difference between Customs and Excise, so I shall tell you, taking the last one first. Excise duty is that which is levied on goods manufactured or sold within a country. So an excise man, never, I can tell you, an excise woman, until my time as a trade unionist, might work, as he would laughingly call it, at a Highland whiskey distillery or a local brewery. And Samuel Johnson, in his famous dictionary, he defined excise thus: a hateful tax levied upon commodities and adjudged not by the common judges of property, but wretches hired by those to whom excise is paid. On the other hand, customs duty is that which is charged on imported goods, and the customs officer, which is what I was, invariably worked at a port or an airport, and we were all jolly good eggs. Our mothers said so. According to most of our clients, we had no fathers. And I never failed to wonder at some of the colorful descriptions that were applied to me. I was once referred to as a salaried highwayman, again as a pimply youth posing as a naval officer, a forsaken garden gnome in fancy dress, a benign face concealing the soul of the Gestapo. And that last one might have been nearer to the truth than the client knew, because Hitler's father was a customs officer. And it still goes on today. Only a couple of months ago, my granddaughter said that I looked like Richard Attenborough on Prozac. Now, just one of the functions of the Water Guard, which is the name given to the uniformed customs officers, was the examination of baggage, where all of life's human foibles and frailties can be observed at close quarters. And it's that which appears to interest most audiences. Now, the most enjoyable feature of work on a baggage bench was the sheer variety. No 2 days were ever the same, and every day brought a memorable experience or incident. Some dramatic, some pathetic, some hilarious, and some all three at once. Such as the woman who insisted that her gold watch was bought at H. Samuels, a chain jeweller's, in Liverpool. And it being clear that she was far too resolute a woman to crack under even a 3rd degree complete with a shining lamp, the officer chose to have a quiet word with her husband, who in no time at all revealed that she had bought it in Ostend the previous day. And as these fateful words were uttered, a hand the size of a leg of pork belted him around the ear, and the lady in question hissed, "You stupid bugger, if you'd said nothing, I'd have got away with that." Or the occasion when a very expensive watch was found in ashes at the bottom of a solid fuel stove in a caravan, a trailer for American members of the audience. The lady owner of the watch upended a teapot full of cold tea over the officer, grabbed a spare pair of panties which were drying, then barred his exit, screaming to the assembled hordes outside, "Look at this! He ripped me knickers off!" But to demonstrate that the taxman always wins was the incident concerning a German resident of the UK who declared 2 boxes of cigars, which amounted to exactly twice his duty-free allowance. And when told how much the duty and tax would be, he became puce with anger and asked what would happen to them if he refused to pay. "Well, sir, they'll go to the Queen's warehouse," said the officer, "and if, after a period of time, you fail to pay the duty, they will become forfeit to the crown." "You mean they will belong to the Queen?" "Yes, sir." He grabbed one of the boxes, hurled it to the ground, stamped it into smithereens, picked up the remnants, threw it on the bench, and he said, "There, there are your Queen's bloody cigars." And the officer picked up the other box and said, "There must be some mistake, sir. These are the Queen's cigars. Those are yours." But demonstrating that even the professionals can cock it up was the case of the 87-year-old matriarch from Cyprus coming to celebrate the christening of her great-great-grandchild. And having been questioned and had her bags chalked off by a new recruit, she was waddling her way to freedom with a demijohn of brandy under her coat when the officer on exit duty exposed her for what she was. But what was most embarrassing was that the original officer had asked what the huge bulge was, but had accepted her explanation that she was 7 months pregnant. Now, one of our most delicate tasks was handling those cases involving the discovery of questionable articles or material in someone's baggage. Now, the laws of the UK relating to the importation of obscene articles and material has always been a legal minefield, the definition of obscenity being a virtual impossible task. In some cases, the risk of getting it wrong is worth taking, as in that of a couple who ran a prep school and who were in possession of articles and literature too numerous and sexually explicit for even a West End club owner to justify. But what do you do when, as happened to someone I know very well, a chap presents himself at the Red Channel and announces that he is in possession of some items that he has bought in Denmark, which he believes exceeds his monetary allowance, and upon which he presumes he will have to pay some duty and tax. And he then produces a whole mass of pornography. Worse, this fella is wearing a classic Flasher's Mac, and he looks just like the nature's idiot often portrayed by Michael Palin. I can tell you that one's first instinct is to start looking around for the hidden camera, convinced that you're on candid camera or you've been framed. But what one actually does do is to ask a question devised by some anonymous civil servant to whom I shall be eternally grateful. And the question is, are these items for your own edification and pleasure, sir? Or madam, as the case may be? And if so, and if there is nothing in there which is obviously designed to corrupt and deprave, no easy judgment to make, you assess and you charge the duty and tax and send him or her on the merry way. One officer who was responsible for cracking some of the most determined attempts to import commercial quantities of pornography possessed such a dry delivery that none of us were ever certain whether or not he was conscious of the hilarity he sometimes caused. He was a dour Scottish Presbyterian bachelor who considered it his bounden duty to guard the nation from a slide into hell and damnation. And whenever he stumbled across the odd bit of porn in someone's case, he would ask the same question as we all would ask, but in such a tone that the poor individual concerned would visibly wither. And would this be imported for your own personal edification and pleasure, sir, or madam? And on one classic occasion, he carefully unfolded and minutely examined one of the life-sized inflatable dolls found in one poor guy's case, and he explained in a matter-of-fact tone, "If there's more than one orifice, sir, such an importation is contrary to the law." Now, one of those so-called urban myths tells of a bomb disposal squad being called to deal with a suitcase in an airport baggage hall which was giving off a buzzing noise. And after a mass evacuation and a controlled explosion, the offending item turned out to be a vibrator which had spontaneously started to do its own thing. It's a good story, and is probably based on one of the many tales relating to such items which are part of the latter-day legends of baggage handling. And my own favorite goes back to, way back to the early 60s, when, it must be said, such accoutrements were still relatively rare and certainly not spoken of in polite company. But the first signs of the decadent decade were to be seen amongst the fashionable young jet-setters who were determined to break the mold of uptight, post-war social and sexual attitudes. And Amsterdam was a favorite spot for a weekend's jaunt for these beautiful people. And a company there manufactured all manner of sexual aids, including what were described in the official tariff as auto-manipulative devices, and whose distinctive hallmark was the very colorful designs incorporated into all of its products. Returning from one such swinging weekend came a party of trendy young things to be confronted by our coy Caledonian. In the process of examining the suitcase belonging to a young woman who was later to become a very familiar face on British TV, he produced, rather like a magician producing a rabbit out of a hat, her newly acquired What's-It, remarkable in size and resplendent in glowing colors. "And what, may I ask, is this, my dear young lady?" And without batting an eyelid, she came back, "I am not your dear young lady, and that is a psychedelic truncheon." Now you know why you need to know what a truncheon is. Not for the first time, an officer was completely upstaged. I must say that my first experience of losing it was when I was working at Dover, and I was clearing the occupants of a fine vintage Bentley Roadster, and it didn't need her passport to prove that she was of the aristocracy and very wealthy with it. Nor did it need his passport to prove that he was her bit of rough trade. But when I read his occupation, I'm afraid I just fell apart. There it was in black and white, meat distributor. Now, this element of eccentricity, exemplified both officers and clients, was to me a source of constant delight. The water guard, I have to say, was totally unlike anything else I knew within the civil service. That's not to say there were no rules or regulations. Of course there were. They were simply interpreted differently. It was a service bursting with self-proclaimed anarchists. There was he who was said to know every dock in Liverpool by its taste, having fallen in every one of them whilst tired and emotional. There was he who literally, during a bout of narcolepsy, literally fell asleep in someone's suitcase in the middle of an examination. And there was he who unaccountably to this day walked the full length of the concourse at Terminal 2 at Heathrow, wearing nothing but his uniform cap and black socks. Charlatans and or lunatics, you might say. Well, whatever else they were or were not, they were absolute magic in the job of catching smugglers or finding smuggled goods. Now, appearance counts for a lot, of course. For example, there was, well, we shall call him Eric Jones. Always impeccably turned out. He was tall, dark, handsome, and with particularly piercing blue eyes that seemed to penetrate the deepest recess of your soul. And there were times when he despaired of ever catching any wrongdoer. He insisted that they confessed before he even had a chance to question them. And I scoffed at such a suggestion until one day I was working alongside him when I heard him ask the statutory question of a young fella, do you have any watches, clocks, cameras, or jewelry? And to my astonishment and to Eric's despair, the guy put his foot on the bench and produced a gold Rolex from around his ankle. On the other side of the coin, there were those who dressed with a shovel, as we say in the UK, and who looked so stupid or gormless that even vicars and nuns were persuaded to try their hand at smuggling. But to no avail. Now, one such lad from Taunton in the west of England was absolute dynamite, with his cap badge somewhere over his left ear, his jacket seeming to have one buttonhole too many, and speaking through a mouthful of mangel wurzels. He really was the classic village idiot. One look at him, and I mean no offense here, ladies, but one look at him, middle-aged women in particular were prepared to fight for the right to have their baggage cleared by him. So you can imagine how they felt as he produced one bit of contraband after another, always accompanied by his country yokel-type commentary. This might not mean very much to you American guests, but I'm sure it will to some of the British. Why, bless my soul, what have we got here, my handsome? If it ain't another bottle of Tia Maria. That's not camp coffee, you know, my love. And this bit of paper here suggests that you be having some jewelry that you bain't be a-telling me of. But in between those two extreme examples were thousands of officers who had developed their own particular way of applying the skills that they acquired and refined over time. A kind of sixth sense. But of course, it was simply the development of the five senses plus a soupçon of applied psychology. This meant that the longer in the tooth you were, the more skilled you became. Unlike many other occupations, it was the veterans who were venerated. All that began to change in the late 1960s. And the reason? Well, the reason was, of course, drugs. There have always been drugs, of course. Queen Victoria consistently fed laudanum, an opiate, to her kids. And the Duke of Windsor, he was not averse to snorting the odd line of cocaine. And his brother, the Duke of Gloucester he was reputed to be an opium and a cocaine addict. And history suggests that if it hadn't been a quiet day in Congress, cocaine might still be legal. Because there was only a majority of one in favor of banning it. But so low on the scale of priorities were drugs that the department in the UK always referred any incident involving them to the police for them to take action, whilst we were supposed to get on with the really important task of collecting the money. But within the space of a decade, the occasional interception of a young hippie with a pouch of low-grade herbal cannabis had degenerated into huge hauls of cannabis in all its forms, heroin, cocaine, amphetamines, LSD, and a host of designer drugs. And behind this flood was organized crime of the most brutal kind, with seemingly unlimited resources at its command. And to have any success in combating this traffic, it became necessary for the whole ethos of customs to change. The traditional non-judgmental approach to smuggling and smugglers gave way to a dedicated determination to detect and destroy an evil trade. Powers of arrest and prosecution were retrieved from the police, and a new and an abrasive breed of younger officers became the spearhead of the attack. And it was whilst I was serving at Heathrow that it began to take shape. And I have to confess that it was an exhilarating time. We felt much as Eliot Ness of the Untouchables in Prohibition-era Chicago must have felt. There was little or no tradition or expertise to build upon. We invented ways of combating the drug traffickers on the hoof, so to speak. Without the benefit of much in the way of modern technology, we collated our knowledge, our suspicions, and even our hunches in as many different ways as there were officers. Now, the first major breakthrough, it could be said, was the coming on stream of trained sniffer dogs. It must be said that the early days weren't all that promising. They did marvelously in controlled exercises in specific circumstances. You could get a piece of cannabis, wrap it in foil, put it in a cigar tube, put some curry powder on top of it, put it behind the galley on a newly arrived aircraft, send the dog on board, and within 2 minutes it would be barking away and pointing his nose in the right direction, and everyone would congratulate themselves. But they just seemed bewildered in the baggage handling areas. And it took some time to realize that because of sloppy handling of drugs over preceding months and years, there wasn't anywhere in the baggage areas that didn't have traces of drugs there to be smelt. So the poor little pooches just went round and round in ever decreasing circles. Nonetheless, successes did come our way, usually lagging behind, somewhere behind the successful traffickers. Had it been otherwise, of course, the street price would have gone up instead of consistently down. But the seizures of drugs did start to mount, slowly at first, then a trickle, then a flood. And the scale and ingenuity of the smuggling were boundless. There were what we would describe as big runs, ships carrying nothing other than drugs as cargo, shipping containers of misdescribed goods, fishing boats which picked up tons of the stuff from deep-sea vessels at prearranged points off the coast, private seagoing yachts putting in one of the thousands of creeks to be found around the coast, torpedo-like tanks welded to ships' hulls below the waterline, aircraft landing at remote airstrips, and even drops by parachute onto lonely moorland. And there were medium runs, false fuel tanks on family saloon cars, cavities between the skins of caravans, trailers, false bottom suitcases, been around since time immemorial, adapted oil drums, where a large drum of oil was there. You'd unscrew the cap, take a stick and do a dip, and you'd come up with oil. But all that was there was a tube welded the length of the drum, and the rest of it was packed with drugs. Hollowed out surfboards, and even the padding of cricket pads or cricket gloves. And most often to be encountered were the small runs, inside books. I'm sure that some of you will remember perhaps B films in the 40s and 50s where you'd see somebody dressed as a priest, clutching a Bible, would be stopped by a customs officer, the Bible would be opened, and a square would be cut out, and in there would be snuggled a bracelet or something or other. Well, they're still using the cut-out books between soles of shoes or sandals, under skull caps of wigs, inside sealed bottles of wine. I'm sure if there are any amateur winemakers, you know now that it's easy to make a professional job of capping and sealing and labeling bottles of wine. Well, if you put a very strong solution of drugs in a bottle, do your business with a cap on the label and bring it through as your wine duty-free allowance. Items made of compressed drugs. I was involved in a seizure of what were imported, what were declared as thousands of vinyl LPs. It turned out that the vinyl wasn't vinyl, it was a disc of compressed cocaine inside the sleeve of the LP. And items impregnated with drugs. You can have material soaked in a very powerful solution, dried, and then the process reversed on arrival. And worst of all, what we called the stuffers and the swallowers. A bit soon after lunch to go into detail of the stuffers and the swallowers, but you would be astonished at how much can be stuffed or swallowed. As many as 270 condoms full of all manner of drugs have been counted, either as they've been extracted from a bodily cavity or as they pass from the smuggler through the transparent pipe of the specially sealed toilet. It's a kind of nightmare edition of the Generation game. Yeah, good game, good game. Keep looking, yeah. Don't forget the cuddly toy. That's for British guests, that. The sheer cheek could sometimes astound. One man, accompanied by half a dozen breathtakingly beautiful young women, presented 17 suitcases at the Green Channel, claiming that they contained the dresses for his dance ensemble, who were to give a special one-night performance in aid of the great Ormond Street Hospital for Sick Children that very evening. He was telling porkies, porky pies, lies, Cockney slang for American guests there. He was telling porkies 3/4 of a ton of finest Lebanese gold cannabis was found therein. On the other hand, there was an Irishman. The fact there was an Irishman has nothing to do with it, but he was. An Irishman in Fleetwood, where I was working at the time, who was caught smoking what he believed to be the finest Moroccan. On analysis, it proved to be dried camel dung. It suited him. He was as high as a kite. Now, the disposal of large amounts of drugs was and remains a problem. Excuse me. All forfeited goods go to the Queen's Warehouse. And after a period of time, they are disposed of in a variety of ways. One of the first attempts of emptying the Queen's Warehouse at Heathrow of its cannabis was disastrous. Sacks and sacks of the stuff were taken under escort to the municipal incinerator at Slough, a nearby town. And each sack was weighed and thrown into the flames